Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
So welcome. And I know a bit about you from other podcast interviews and stuff like that. I'm sure there will be things that come up even about your story that at the very least I've always wanted to ask you, but it was a different interviewee last time. But to start really broadly, I know that you are, interestingly enough, you are a therapist, which is something that I'm passionate about as well. You do stand-up comedy. You're an active community member of the Ex-Religious Community in Toronto, I believe. But taking a step back for a second, I wonder if you could kind of summarize broad strokes of what kind of upbringing you had, what kind of religious environment you were raised in.
Yeah, so the religious environment I was raised in was kind of interesting. I kind of had a foot in both worlds. I mean, both those worlds are fundamentalist, but they were two different worlds to me. My family, so my father was raised Hasidish, but went through the Yeshivish education system, so Torah Vadas. And my mother was Yeshivish from old school Lakewood. So for anyone listening in who's not from those backgrounds, fairly hardcore fundamentalist, very strict beliefs. And that was my family growing up. But we lived in what was called the modern Orthodox community. So my friends and the people around me had a different set of beliefs and had less restrictions. And for me, there was always a pull between both of those. My family wanting to be one way, my friends wanting me to be another way, me wanting to be, I didn't know what, but something, with all those kind of confusing things. And yeah, that was essentially the world I grew up in.
And this was in the United States?
This was in Canada. I was born and raised in Toronto.
Okay, interesting. And I'm curious what was going on for your parents. It's not every day that you encounter somebody with such a mix, right? Even just Hasidic marrying Litvish or Yeshivish and then choosing a different neighborhood. What was going on for your parents that this all played out that way?
So my parents were each rebels in their own world, which did not translate into them understanding my rebellion at all. But they were rebels in their own world. So my father was raised Hasidish, Ger Hasidish, from actually the Ger family. So my grandfather, my great-grandfather were friends with the Ger Rebbe at the time, of Chavusas, lived close in that community, a few houses down. And my father wanted a different life for himself. So my father went to university, he went to City College, and he wanted to pull away from that. And my mother was also very similar. So my mother's the only one in her family to go to university as well. So her brothers are both Rosh Yeshiva, her sister lives in Muncie, and her, it was her way of, she didn't like the world she was in. She wanted to separate around from that. She was fascinated by secular education. She's very well read. So that was kind of a pull away from them. And they met in university. They met in City College. And then my father became an aeronautical engineer, and his work moved him around until he moved to Toronto. When we a bunch of places. They lived in Connecticut, they lived in Montreal, and then eventually Toronto, where I was born. And when they settled here, they were enamored by the less restrictive community, but were still kind of very beholden to their backgrounds. So, they want, my parents encouraged all of us to go to university, which was a huge change from the communities, even the communities we were in. But other things like no TV, no talking to girls, and very other restrictive kind of things. The dress was very, black and white. So those kind of things they were very connected to and felt. They felt, when I pulled away from it later, I think they felt a little bit betrayed, in the sense that they pulled away from the parts that made sense to them, but kept a connection with all these different parts that were very important to their identity. And then those things were extra special when I rejected those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I am just particularly fascinated by the picking and choosing kind of dynamic. I think my parents did that to some degree too, so maybe it fascinates me more. So I'm harping a little bit on this, but I'm curious what your take is on what was it that they, secular education was important to them, where other Hasidic people would say that is the work of the devil too. So what was it that allowed them to say, oh yeah, this is great, but talking to girls is terrible?
So I think for them it depends on. Well, I think there were two parts of it. One is how far it goes back. So some of the more recent, like ultra orthodoxy, is a relatively new movement. I don't think this is exactly accurate, but it largely started after the war, and also by Rabbi Aaron Cutler in Lakewood, starting like a rabbi community. So these are relatively new concepts, and a lot of the no secular education, a lot of the isolationism and things like that, they viewed as more modern attachments that they didn't necessarily agree with. But when it came to things that they viewed as more traditional, such as a separation of the genders, that was something that was much more inherent and connected to their Judaism.
Fair enough. I can appreciate that distinction. So, what was it like for you to be raised in this contradictory world?
Very confusing. So, I mean, I have my own personality. I've been sort of rebelling against my society since I was a small child. Like, I was expelled 6 times throughout my elementary and high school experience. I never really fit in, and I was always kind of challenging it. And it was very confusing to me that they seemed to share my values, but not the expression of them. And that, like, I would love, like, my father died when I was 18 years old, and I would love to go back and talk to him now. I wish I could have that kind of dialogue and see how he would view my journey, because I believe the values are mapped on very similarly to my parents, and the expression is very different. And I didn't understand how their values matched their expression. And I think that was very confusing for me.
Yeah, so like if you're that much of a rebel, how are you suddenly conforming hook, line, and sinker to X amount of things that some rabbi is telling you to do? Didn't your rebelliousness get you this far? Why did you choose to stop here and not continue? I resonate a lot with that from some of the choices my parents made as well. Were there areas, what were the areas I would say that like your personality was the most rubbed against, or stated differently, the biggest mismatch with your own preferences growing up?
So I have an issue with authority. I always have had an issue with authority, and you can see it in the way I talk, the way I write, in my comedy. All of it was always a big part of it. When I was 13 years old, I was diagnosed by a religious therapist with oppositional defiance disorder, which I don't think is an accurate diagnosis. Now that I've come across it in my professional career, it seems to look very different. But there was always this idea to me that I didn't like that authority was just granted. I when someone earned my respect, I was perfectly behaved. Like, so there are teachers who I was a goody two shoes. I would defend them against my classmates. I would do whatever they asked me to do. And then there were other teachers where they would come in and I would have to show them that I was the toughest kid in the room. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of me going up against my rebbeim, going up against my teachers, mocking them, insulting them. I would try to tear them down off their high horse. I don't know why it was so important for me to do that, but in a system where authority is everything, where structure is everything, and where there's this underlying idea, not underlying, openly stated idea that you don't ask questions, you just follow rules, I couldn't do that. So everything was so I would start by asking questions, usually innocently, but when those weren't met, I would then take it upon, like, I would get this sort of anger, and I would take it upon myself to show my classmates, to show my peers how ridiculous it all is. So I wanted to show my like, when I would challenge and mock my rebbeim, I wanted to tear them down in front of my classmates. And I think I still do that today. Like, I think that is still a part of the way I approach things. And when I communicate, when I speak, when I do any of those kind of things, I'm trying to remove the mask. I'm trying to remove the fear. And when I work like I do, I write comedy for the Ex-Orthodox community, the main goal of that, I mean, there's many different goals in it. The main goal is to have fun. The second main goal is to parody the characters as they would sound, but highlight that absurdity, so that those who were impacted by it, those who were traumatized by it, or those who are afraid of it can laugh, can be amused, and experience that absurdity the way I see it.
Yeah. I relate a lot to that. I think we have a lot of shared goals. We'll talk about that more in a bit. I call it diffusing the weight of that authority through comedy. It turns it into like a giant balloon that you've just poked with a pin, kind of.
I think that's a good metaphor.
Yeah. So I'm curious, were your siblings like this too?
Rebellious? No, a little bit, but not all my siblings are religious. All my siblings are quite religious. I have one sister who became modern Orthodox as her rebellion, but she's a very religious form of modern Orthodox. There were their own rebellions. Like my brother used to make a lot of trouble. He would climb down the sides of the school on fire hoses and break into the chemistry lab and things like that. But they always accepted the yoke of authority. To them, it was always supreme. That didn't carry over. I seem to be the only person in my family who had that kind of rejection of it.
What's your birth order, if I may get all psychodynamic?
I'm the youngest. I'm the youngest of 6.
Okay, so maybe that's it. I don't know. Okay, cool. So you're kind of not buying in throughout, at least to some degree, if that sounds accurate. And so, yet from what I know of your story, you actually stuck around for a while. You actually got married in that system, and I'm curious, what was it that kept you around for that long?
So I did buy in, and I bought in hard, but not so much in my childhood. When my father died at 18, that was a very big shock for me, and I think that had an impact on my direction from that point. And I started getting involved in Kirov. Kirov is essentially Jewish missionary work. I know one of the big Jewish phrases is that we don't have missionaries, we don't in the sense that we don't target other religions, but Orthodox Jews, and especially ultra-Orthodox Jews, have this idea that they want to convince non-Orthodox Jews to become Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, and we use fairly similar methodologies to Christian missionaries. So I got involved in that world because it met a number of my criteria. I wasn't exactly a popular kid in high school, and Kirov I like to make events when I was in high school, like to make parties and stuff like that. And Kirov was like, you can still do that and also get religious points for it. So it combined a piece of me that I could connect with Judaism and a desire to get more I kind of wanted to do what I thought my father would have wanted. So I think that kind of pushed me into it. And from there, I started making it my own. That period of time in my life, which spans for roughly 7 or 8 years, I rejected the form of Judaism that I grew up with, but I had discovered this other form of Orthodox Judaism that I personally had given my stamp of approval of. And in that case, I became the good boy that I was for the teachers I respected towards Judaism. This was now my Judaism, the Judaism I loved. And all the people who got it wrong, they were getting it wrong, and I needed to explain that, but I had this deep connection to it. At the same time, it met all my other needs. It met all my social needs. I was suddenly throwing these massive parties that I was getting funding for, and I was the popular kid. Everyone liked me. Everyone wanted to be invited to my parties. They wouldn't phrase it like that. It was very in-rabbinic phrasing. And I would also, another part of me was I was always very psychological. Like the reason why I became a therapist was because since I was a kid, everyone told me to do that. And I like talking to people about their problems, talking out people's thoughts, and kind of just playing with it back and forth. And that became philosophical and rabbinic. And therefore, I was popular, I was wise, I was respected, I was everything I wanted to be, and I was very religious. I started going for smicha, I became a rabbi, and this was something that was completely out of my range. In my high school yearbook, when it says where they'll be in 20 years, as a joke, I have respected rabbinic authority. So this was completely strange to me, and also it was a form of Judaism that I suddenly loved, that I suddenly connected to, and this became very important for me for a period of time. So that's how I got connected to it. Did you ask me how I left it off?
No, not yet.
Or?
Not yet. We're building up to that. That's
Yeah.
the great reveal. Two questions. One, a technical one. Who were you doing Kirov with? What was the organization?
So because of the whole thing, I rejected all the organizations. I started with Asian or Sameach, and then I remember I gave a whole speech on how I thought it was inappropriate that you could have a totally different path in life because one rabbi served salmon and the other rabbi served gefilte fish, and you should go there. I was trained by Esha Torah, and there were a lot of things in that training that I didn't like, that I thought was very disconcerting. There was a lot of like mechanical parts of it. Like one of the things that I remember really stood out to me was we were told specifically to target attractive women because that would bring other people in. And I'm like, that's not like, if the Torah is so great, I should just be selling Torah. So I started my own organization, something we called it Project Tish. It started from its own, like the original plan of it and why it had that name was it was just me and a friend who we were sad about the fact that some of our friends on long Friday nights were like going out and breaking Shabbos because they were just so bored. And we got into a conversation with one. He was like, I don't want to, but I'm so bored. And we're like, we're going to remedy this. So we started making cholent and getting 6 packs of beer and just singing songs in my friend's basement. And then over the course of that summer, we met a man named Rabbi Charles Lebo, who's actually from Hamilton originally. And he helped us find funding to basically start our own. So we had independent funding for this organization that was centered around these Friday night dinners. And then eventually it became like these whole Shabbaton events.
Right. Ironically, you still sometimes host Friday night dinners.
I still do it every second week.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I love it. So one bit more fundamental question. What was it about this flavor of Judaism that you had crafted or found or carved out that did work for you?
So the one rule that I had for my organization was no coercion. So what our goal was try to keep it really simple. We would provide you a good meal, and then Orthodox people would meet non-Orthodox people, and our hope was that the beauty of Orthodoxy would translate over. But there were a number of different instigating events that led to the creation and it getting bigger. So one of our rules was it doesn't matter if someone becomes Orthodox, they are still always invited. So there was no idea that if you didn't, so the Kirov system, the missionary system that I was trained in had a very specific model. First, you meet people in university, and then there's a paid lecture series. The paid lecture series runs for 10 lectures, and this is the same in all the different organizations, Eish or Sameach. I forget the names of some of the other ones, but the other ones as well. And then during that lecture series, the goal of the Kirov rabbi was to pick off those who were interested and invite them over for meals. Then you would invite over this group, and you would have Shabbos.
To clarify, the paid aspect is you were paid to attend, which is the opposite of a normal paid lecture series where you have to put money in. Right.
No, yes, sorry. You are paid to attend. So you get $400 for attending 10 sessions. The prices might have gone up with inflation. Who knows? But that was it when I was doing it. And their goal was, well, of course you'd want to come. Free food, free money. And that's actually how I got into training for Kirov. The trainings also came with free food. And then you pull people away to your dinners. Okay. Once you have them in your dinners for a while, after 1 year, you are supposed to convince them to go on a 3-week trip to Israel. During that, and each time that you go through one of these things, the cone narrows. So not everyone who comes to the dinners will go on the trip to Israel. Those who don't make it into the next stage tend to get dropped. So if you don't go on that 3-week trip to Israel, they're not gonna drop it right away, but you're gonna slowly stop getting invited to Friday night.
Slow fade. The slow fade. They fade you out.
The slow fade. And then from the 3-week trip, then depending on the organization, either they immediately try to get you to stay in Israel for longer, or you come back, there's another year, and then 6 months to a year, and then they try to convince you to go back for a summer, and then over that summer program, Aish has a program called Jewel, Essentials, and then over that summer program, they try to convince you to essentially give up university and stay continuing in Israel. That cone, that dropping of people really upset me. It really hurt me that you gave support conditionally. And that was always my rule of the missionary work. It's the rule of my organization I run now, which is support when offered is unconditional, which means if we offer you support, as long as you need it, it's not entirely unconditional. It's unconditional from external objectives. If you make yourself unwelcome, if you make the environment unsafe, you will not be invited back. But if you just don't accept our beliefs, that would not be grounds for removing people from the community. And it was a point of pride that we had members of our community for the whole 7 years who never became religious, who had no interest in it, and still had positive experiences. So that was, to me, the difference between our approach and the approach of missionary work, and also the Orthodox Judaism I came from.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to hear, I grew up in that exact space. I grew up as an Aish kid. It's cool to hear it summarized so well the way you did. And you do this really well also in other points where I've heard you talking. It's a very nice boiling down of the systems, it's like the framework. There's a lot of fluff, but you're able to really summarize, this is the architecture underneath it all. This is the grand plan. And one other, like a thing that popped into my head, Aish had a very interesting thing that if you became too religious, they dropped you too. I think you might have even alluded to this, because you're no longer of interest to them if you've been converted. They need to go find fresh souls. So you really only mattered during a very fine period of time where you were on the fence, where they could get you moving forward. But once you were in the meat grinder, then you can go find somebody else to have you for Shabbat dinner, because they had all these special tactics and tricks and needed to devote themselves back to the next round. And it was fascinating. So like I used to mock my mother for this, even when I was religious. It was still absurd to me. We would have a ton of Shabbos guests every week. We lived right in the old city, but she would have, if somebody showed up and wasn't Jewish, it was a complete waste, right? Because what the fuck are we here for? And then if they were too religious, if they were like a yeshiva kid or a seminary girl who had snuck in somehow to Jeff Seidel knew that on pain of death, you do not send Rebecca Shore a frum person, because that would be a total waste of food. And so it was just a fascinating middle ground that she just wanted to spend her time in. It's fascinating. It just shows you how conditional this, like the smiles and the being nice, is not inherent to you being a human being. Yeah. Go ahead.
There is a reality of it. So, like the people who are doing it, when they're doing it, I think they feel it in the moment, but that conditionality supersedes even their own humanity. So like, I wouldn't say that for most of the people that I've met in it, that it's entirely fake all the time. In fact, I think usually it's people with beautiful souls who want to help people, but the rules of conditionality supersede. Not only it creates it encourages their humanity and also supersedes it when it's no longer effective for the goal.
Yeah, you could have a debate of like what's going on for them. Yeah, one of my bigger issues is a lot of those laws, that the dehumanizing laws of Judaism around, like, oh, non-Jews are less than human, and these weird narratives that you have. It's like, oh, there was a terror attack, but oh, it wasn't Jews who were killed. And you do this really weird emotional things to get yourself relief or to get yourself removed from certain situations. And these are good people. So it's a much bigger debate as to what is going on for those people who to be really nice in a vacuum, but then this us versus them thing that runs really, really deep and affects it. So moving along, I guess at this point, to, you're quite entrenched and you're doing it your way and it seems to be working for you. So then what happens that actually eventually causes you to leave?
I got more entrenched. So, well, no, that's not entirely accurate. Okay, there are a few steps that led to me leaving. So at 24, I got married. And at 24, I was in Kollel. I was learning full-time. The girl I married was a Beis Yaakov teacher. Like it was the exact path. She wanted to do Kirov. I wanted to do Kirov. We had a path laid out. Up until that point in my life, there is a piece of my story was I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be liked and loved. And part of that was by my imaginary future spouse. I wanted to be good enough for the person I was going to marry. And so I'll come back to that in a moment because that plays in a little bit later into the journey. I think what really happened was I became a teacher. So I became a teacher in the Jewish school system, and I loved it. I really enjoyed being a teacher. But during my time as a teacher, I got to see the inner workings of the education system, and it broke me. I can't put it in. I would love to put it in lighter words. I can't. It was so devastating to see on a variety of levels. The way they handled children's curiosities, to what the rabbis said, like in the staff room behind closed doors, like that was a version. Like I was there to watch their venting and to letting off steam, and that's a side of people I had never seen before. The effect it had on kids. There was a gay student in one of my classes who was not openly gay, obviously, but was exploring it to the point that the school got wind of it, and I saw their reaction to that, and that was fairly horrifying. It wasn't directed at the kid, but there was a lot of like very heavy demonization of it following because they were concerned, and a lot of reactivity. And then the other thing was, my wife was also a teacher in the Beis Yaakov school system, and one of the Beis Yaakov is the girls' school. And in Orthodox Judaism, because of the gender segregation, we're essentially two different religions. We're related to each other. There's a lot of overlap, but women are raised very differently and have their own flaws in the educational system that are also horrific. So I was seeing my own side, and I was watching her side as well. And we stayed quite religious for 4 years together. And then one Shabbos, it was in the winter. So Shabbos starts at sundown. So in the winter, that's like 4:30, and you're just left with this block of time with nothing to do. And me and my wife would get into these long, long conversations. And one night, just randomly, the conversation was, what do we think about this religion? And it went on for about 6 hours. And I honestly don't remember who asked, but at the end of it, one of us asked the other one, do you really believe in all this? And we thought about it and we're like, I guess not. So her problems and my problems kind of came together and collapsed each other. We also had different issues with Judaism. She had more issues with like malaria and suffering and like, how can God exist in this world? And mine was more technical. I saw the history of Judaism as very much supporting putting certain individuals in power and protecting their power. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like a system God would make. That sounds like a system man would make. And then together, I crashed her remaining stands and she crashed my remaining stands. And then that last piece that I mentioned earlier came in where I realized I didn't have to be religious for her. I wasn't faking it, but there was still a piece of me that I would never fully come to terms with it because I didn't want to crash that, not just to crash my marriage, but also to crash how I was viewed. And then when that piece went away and her view of it kind of all came together, we made the decision right then and there. We kept Shabbos till the end of Shabbos. And then the next night we booked a cruise out of Florida for 1 week where we did a trial run because we wanted to test being not religious. We went on it, ate bacon, didn't keep Shabbos, like complete break, decided on that cruise we're going to leave the religion. And then we decided it would be too damaging to our students to leave mid-school year. So we stayed in the closet, we call it, but we stayed secretly not religious for the remaining like 5 months left to the school year. And then we were already planning on moving to Israel because she was going to medical school there. And then when we got on the flight, we got on religious, we got off secular and just lived. I mean, there was a lot of adjustment, don't get me wrong. But as far as like our shift, we switched in the Helsinki airport. I took off my white shirt, black pants, put on like little booty shorts and a tight t-shirt because I didn't know how non-Jews dressed, and I just assumed as sluttily as possible. And then we were off, and from that point on, we were secular.
Amazing. I love that. I've always been struck by your story and its parallels to mine specifically. I think we've chatted about this a bit, but it is kind of crazy. Most people take a more gradual transition, and yours was quite sudden. It was in the presence of your wife at the time. It was interesting that you held off for certain things, I think showing more consideration than the Orthodox Jews would ever have shown to you, but you did that. One last question before we move on to like the next phase, right? Like you're at the transition, but I am still curious. Still, you have this track record of making things your own, of like removing the shit that you don't like and saying, yeah, but I'm going to keep it. And if your issues were primarily around, oh, rabbinical oppression, people are in the wrong hierarchy, did it occur to you, or what was the system in which you threw out the whole thing, as opposed to like, let me go back to, I don't know, the 5 books of Moses and try to make this the Pesi religion the way you did Pesi Kirov?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So first of all, Orthodox Judaism did a really good job of convincing me that all the other versions of Judaism were absurd. Like that was a big part of my upbringing in Orthodox Judaism, was how silly conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism was. So when I left, they didn't seem like options to me. And I didn't have a connection to those. So to me, they weren't my religion. And to an extent, I still don't consider them my religion. I mean, they're my heritage, they're my ethnicity, and I think if you speak to me again in 10 years, I'm going to have explored them more fully. I've definitely felt that shift over time as I've been further away. But when I left, it wasn't about switching from one Judaism to another. There was no version of that Judaism that connected to me. So it was a simple break. My connection to coming back to it, to identifying with it, and now there is some relationship with it. Ironically, mostly through my ex-Orthodox community is my relationship to Judaism now. But there was no idea of I'm going to do it in another form. It was I'm going to do it my way, but Judaism's not a part of that.
Right, right. And it's fascinating. I've said the very same thing. It was the black and white thinking that my parents raised me with that ironically ended up with me having zero gradient and zero tolerance for things that they now beg me to, like, just do a Shabbat dinner or just do the fun parts of the holidays. And I was like, I wasn't raised like that. I was raised that if I had a slightly less amount of matzah, I'm going to hell. So I guess I'm not having any matzah at all. And that same fundamentalist thinking maybe keeps a lot of people in line, but when you leave, you go all the way. And so I end up being a lot less Jewish than even the average secular Jew because of that swing to the other side. So okay, I think that explains it really well. So moving along now to this new life, the booty shorts that it brings. So clearly, right, as you said, there's a lot to get used to. And actually, I'm curious because Israel and secular life in Israel is very different than what it would have been like to have been surrounded by non-Jews in America. So over the next few years, what was the transition out for you?
So it was very interesting because there's a transition out and then sort of a transition back in. So I lived in Beersheba and I did not live in a religious community. So to me, the religious world was completely gone. They existed, like I saw, synagogues, I saw people walking in the street, but it had nothing to do with me. The only time that I related to religious life at all was my wife at the time had one sister in Israel. And when we would visit her, it was a religious weekend. And like when I would speak to my mother or family for the first 3 years, I didn't tell her that I wasn't religious. So there was still that form of like talking about it and relating to it and relating to those experiences. But otherwise, it was completely absent. So at first, it was a huge shock. I didn't know how to talk to people, like at all. First of all, I didn't know how to talk to women. Hugging freaked me out. Like, do I hug people? Do I not hug people? Is it inappropriate if I hug people? And I just didn't know how to navigate it. I felt like an outsider in every conversation. I felt very uncomfortable socially, like I wanted to get out of there because I felt like I didn't belong and like I must be messing up the conversations. I must be so weird. And then the other thing that was very shocking to me was when I left, I didn't consider Orthodox Judaism that crazy. I just considered it incorrect. And then every time I would talk about my history with people, they would get this like slack-jawed, wide-eyed look. And I'd be like, what? I wasn't even trying to surprise you. And that reaction kept shocking me and confusing me. And I'm like, why does everyone think that it was so crazy? It wasn't so crazy. And then over time, I developed a few social groups there. I was a teacher there. I was an ESL teacher. So from my fellow teachers, from my wife's friends in medical school. And also right in the beginning when I was trying to make friends, I went on an English speaking group and joined every English speaking event there was a group thing there was. So I joined a Dungeons and Dragons game that lasted one session before everyone gave up on it and it became a poker game. But that was another social group. That was largely with non-Jews, actually. It was with graduate academics from Europe, mostly in Beersheva University, Soroka. And it was completely separated. So first a shock, and then a slowly, this is my life, and then it became normal. And then I finally got used to that, and I was a normal person out there, and then I moved back to Toronto, back to the religious community as a non-religious person, and that became super weird all over again. So that was reintegrating it into my life was very strange. I became a teacher in the religious school system again, which I was shocked at. I didn't think that was even a possibility. When I was coming back to Toronto, I called my boss in the school and I said, "Can I use you as a reference for other schools?" And he's like, "Why wouldn't you come back here? Like, we really liked you here." And I'm like, "When I land, we're going to have a conversation." So we had a conversation, and I was shocked. The school said, "We think you should come back anyways," which I was very touched by. I was very shocked by, and I came back. And I taught there for 1 year, and then the community was like very uncomfortable with it because the way I taught was always outside of the box. And they always I did special education. I did a lot of the projects and activities. I was the curriculum coordinator for the school. So this was Yesode, which is the big Haredi school in Toronto, and I was the curriculum coordinator before I left. So that was always my role. But now outside of the box was suddenly threatening, and that became very different. So my role became one that was like 1 foot in the community, 1 foot out of the community. And then I started getting involved in the Ex-Orthodox community. And that also became very confusing for me because it started bringing up all my emotions about Orthodox Judaism. I didn't have them so much for the 3 years initially after I left. I was like, it was strange, it was weird, I've moved on. And then it became my life. I was suddenly back in it again. I was in the schools. I was watching the system again. I was talking to people who were involved in it. And it was a new stage where I started becoming much more involved in the ex-Orthodox community. I started becoming much more involved in being around them. And it became a huge part of my identity to the point that now, even when I get into conversations with non-Jewish people, I find myself always bringing up my Judaism. It comes up in every conversation, and I start telling stories about it, and I can't stop it. Like, it's compulsive. And I don't necessarily want to stop it entirely, but I don't need it to come out in the first hour of every first date I've ever been on. But it does. And that was an interesting transition. So there were 2 transitions. There was a pull away from it, and I think had I stayed in that, I would have been a very different person. And I've met those OTD people who pull away from it, who separate right away, and they're just like, yeah, I left, I have some feelings about it, and it's not really so present in my life right now. And then there are other OTD people who they've left 15, 20 years ago, and it's still, what they think about 3-4 times a day. And I shifted from one of those to the other.
Which is usually the opposite direction of the shift, which is fascinating. And one was in Israel, which I also find very surprising. But again, if you're not surrounded by Orthodoxy, it matters. So you're saying it's still going on for you now. How many years has it been since you moved back to Toronto?
Since I moved back to Toronto in 2018.
It's been like 6 years.
So I've been here now for 6 years.
6 years. And the first year you were a teacher, and then I'm assuming you went to become a therapist. And so, yeah. I'm curious.
Slightly longer than that. I was a teacher for 4 years.
Oh, okay.
When I came back. So I was a teacher I was a teacher until 2021. I taught in my school for a year, and then when they let me go, they were very apologetic about it, and they were like, "I really don't want to do this. I know you're a great teacher, but our community doesn't like you." So they sent me to the Chabad community that didn't know me, hoping it would be better, and my clash with authority was harder in the Chabad community because I thought it was going to be less strict because my experience with Chabad is much more open because I'm used to their essentially the missionary side, yeah. But this was the behind the scenes, and I was in a school where English was optional and discouraged. If you went to English, there were 2 trips a year that you weren't allowed to go on, like school trips to New York, and one to New York, one to Montreal, I think. And You can't go on it if you go to English. And you had to stay an extra hour and a half in school. School ended at 4 o'clock for the other students and 5:30 for my students. And it came to the point, like, even I used to love, I still love teaching, but I was really into it. And I would get very involved in making my curricula. And like, I remember I was teaching English, so I made an English curricula over the summer one year where it was tracing the history of the migrations to England and how they affected the language. So the Picts and the Celts, and then watching how their wards, because they had a lot of like earth wards and tree, like nature wards, because like that was their experience. And then you have the Anglo-Saxon revolutions, you have Roman invasions, you have later the Norman invasions, you have Viking invasions, and all of these contribute to the language and bring in a lot of words. And I was tracing that and building the language, and I was really proud of it. And I brought it to the principal of the school, and he looked at it, and he's like, "You can't do this." And I was I'm not very surprised. I expected that, but I'm like, "All right, tell me what you want me to take out, and I'll take it out." I was always prepared to do that. He's like, "No, you can't do it at all." And I'm like, "Why not?" He's like, "This is too interesting, and we don't want to encourage the kids to come to English. We're worried that if you have a curriculum like this, other kids will want to join, and we don't want to encourage that behavior." And I think that was one of the breaking points, but there were a bunch along the way. But I started realizing in 2020, especially at the start of COVID and the way they were handling COVID, that this was not my world anymore. So I started my master's degree for therapy in 2020. I left the school when I started my practicum, so in 2021, and I've been now a therapist for 3 years.
Very cool. So you mentioned emotions, right? Emotions, identity is a bigger piece, right? That who knows where that stops. But emotions that come up as you kind of come in contact, or that identity, or like you see religious Jews. I mean, what comes up for me is I've noticed I live, because Hamilton is the way it is, I can go for weeks without seeing a religious Jew, and then I'm fine. It's like I have moved on. It's been 9 years in my case. But then if something comes up, it used to be I worked for Orthodox Jews until very recently. If I'm around my siblings who remind me, or something happens in the news, or it finds its way to me because I'm only one step removed, I get all triggered all over again, and all these emotions come up, and I was like, I thought I was over that, and now I'm blogging incessantly all over again. So I'm curious what it is for you, and if you've noticed the emotional shift over time. Are they different emotions from 6 years ago versus today?
So yeah, there's a whole bunch in that. So I'm going to approach this essentially from a trauma lens, because I think that's a lot of what's happening. So when you experience trauma, you often go through flashbacks. You go back to the time and place where you were when you get triggered, when you get reminded of it in some way. And there's different things your body is doing when it does that. But and I'm oversimplifying it by saying it's processing. But one of the things your body is trying to do is trying to process what happened. And oftentimes it doesn't end up doing that. So you just go back in these loops. And that's one of the things you work on in therapy, is identifying when you're doing this and shifting it from an ineffective processing system to an effective processing system. So lots of things trigger me. And the shift, I think, has been I've been trying to process them effectively when I get triggered. I don't think I did that in the beginning. I think my initial response was avoidance, which is a common response to being triggered, shutting down, like avoiding thinking about it, avoiding engaging with it, just getting angry, and maybe venting. I think venting was a big part of how I dealt with it initially. And that venting was also not really processing it. A little bit, I think venting processes automatically, but it wasn't in any kind of formalized way. And I think what shifted over time was more of like seeing it from more context, seeing it on how it engages with things, seeing what parts of it I'm bringing to the equation and what parts of it are like kind of global. So for example, if I see something happening, it will usually trigger me because I've had a negative experience with it in some way. So I'll start by trying to identify what my negative experiences were and how it relates to this. Is it connected to it, or is it not connected to it? And is my frustration about my own experience, or is it about this reality? And it can be both. It can be about mine. It can be about the reality. Sometimes it's either or, sometimes both of them. And I really I think what's shifted now is that understanding that Orthodox people are people. I have a lot more sympathy for the individuals in the system. I have a lot less animosity over time when I've seen, well, in a bunch of ways. But first of all, I've seen the commonality of this among all fundamentalist religions. So like, I'm like, oh, why would you do that? Oh, it's anyone who's in that system acts that way. And even the parts I didn't understand that seemed cruel or inhumane to me seem to be global for anyone raised in that kind of system. I think I also understand that people hurt other people. Like that is a reality of the world. As I work in therapy, I don't work with Jewish people primarily. I'm licensed in the States and in Canada, but primarily I work in the States, and it's mostly whoever I take their insurance of, because that's how you find therapists in the United States. And just everyone gets hurt and harmed by their parents, by their families, by their communities in so many different ways, that I was never hurt and harmed by my community. So that, I think, was helpful in understanding that this is just kind of how humanity works sometimes, and I'm seeing a specific expression of it. And I still feel that because it's still my expression and still the one that hurt me. But reminding myself of that, reminding myself of how they're engaging with it. And now that I've reminded myself of it so many times, it's also my initial reaction is like, oh, I'm watching someone who's like, I feel more sympathy for to use the abuser, abusee kind of paradigm. I feel more sympathy for the abuser than I did in the past.
It's fascinating. To elaborate on two things that you just said, I'm curious, one, were there specific triggers in particular, if you're okay with sharing some of those? Or I'm curious what was triggering in particular for you?
Certainly. So there were a bunch of things. Sexual education in the community harmed me a lot, and still to this day harms me and still impacts me in various ways. So hearing that really triggers me. Abuse. So I grew up with physical abuse, and I grew up with the community and my family and various things enabling and covering over that abuse. So that triggers me a lot when someone tells me this is what's going. So I can visualize in my head, because there's two things that trigger me now. Things I randomly bump into, which happens like once every 6 months, and then me going on social media and actively triggering myself. Don't know why I do it. Could not tell you. Definitely doesn't improve my mood. But I definitely do that. And seeing like a post of someone explaining how their husband is abusive triggers me to one level. And then seeing the responses of how it gets covered over. Like, oh, you have to just understand, or men are like that, or try showing more empathy, or maybe like blaming the victim. All the various different things I see, each one of those inflames me. It makes me so angry. And then sometimes I trigger myself intentionally, because when I'm that angry, I write a lot better. So I will, if I am in the mood of writing, I will trigger myself intentionally first, and then I will write something about the.
I grapple a lot with the fact that I have a lot less to write about, and I don't write nearly as well when I'm not angry. So I find that fascinating. It's like, what will be when I'm just completely at peace and never creative ever again? So that's something to remain to be discovered. And one last thing, I was curious from you around something you said, and maybe this is your psychological perspective. I'm very used to venting, right? And I'm curious, what is the difference between venting and, let's say, talking to a therapist? What does that transformation, as somebody who has vented endlessly in writing and in person and all those first dates, as you say, right? I've been there. What have you found shifts a vent, which is only marginally beneficial, to actually processing and getting it out of the system?
Sure. So a vent is undirected. A vent goes everywhere, and it's never challenged. Your view is never challenged in it. I mean, there's a lot that goes into venting, but venting is a dump of everything. And in that dump, you verbalize or by writing your thoughts, and that in and of itself is an effective processing tool. So I'll tell clients to do that with a lot of different things they're thinking, which is like write it out or say it out loud, and you'll realize that it forces you to slow down, it forces you to hear how the pieces connect, and there is inherent processing in that. So I don't mean to bash venting. Venting is wonderful. But within a therapy session, or even without a therapy session, because you can do this on your own with just, online CBT tools or narrative therapy tools or a journal or anything like that. But there are many, many different tools that can be applied to a vent. So slow down and see it from another perspective. Or, someone like a common one I get in venting is someone's talking about how it affects other people all throughout the vent. And I'll stop and be like, well, how are you feeling in that situation? Or how did that impact you in that situation? Or how did that affect you? And how does, your sister being in tragedy impact your life? And people are like, well, this isn't about me. This is about my sister. I'm like, well, no, it's your therapy session. It's about you. So I think refocusing it on yourself is helpful. Sometimes challenging it. So like challenging, I think, has to be done very carefully because you don't want to impose your own beliefs on it. Well, was it from that perspective? And you're saying they acted this way. What evidence? Oh, they thought this. What evidence do you have in that? So you can bring in cognitive distortions, like, are you mind reading? Is this black and white thinking? Kind of things like that. But you can also a lot of times challenge it from a positive perspective. A lot of people are very negative about themselves in their events. So rephrasing it with, this is what I did. Well, looking through that, what did you do that helped the situation? I don't know if I did anything that helped the situation. And then going through the pieces, well, there was actually, you left the room when you felt you were getting overwhelmed. That helped diffuse the situation. You said this, but it didn't work. Yes, but you still tried. Or whatever it is that you're bringing awareness of. So you do a lot of things in therapy that have nothing to do with venting. Responding to venting, I think, is usually the first stage in a several stage process. It's these tools that highlight the areas and then you move from there. But yeah, you view it from another perspective. You add context. You role play someone talking to themselves or experience that situation or how they would talk to someone in that situation. You elaborate on what exactly their points are, or you slow them down. So a lot of times, especially people with neurodivergence, when they vent, they go from piece to piece to piece all over the place, and they don't really know where their story is going. And then you can, if you hear it, you'll hear not such a big deal, not such a big deal, not such a big deal, huge deal, not such a big deal, not such a big deal. And you can be like, let's circle back, elaborate a little bit more on that part that seemed really important to you, and just bringing them in. And the truth of the matter is, you can do this honestly with a friend. Venting with a friend who's willing to not just be a yes man is actually quite beneficial. This is a lot of the skills that I'm describing in this were things that I used even before therapy. A lot of what I've learned in therapy are kind of, once you have these things and once you bring awareness to these things, how to actually build on them, correct them, change them, not necessarily, correct them sometimes, understand them other times, but those processing tools kind of build from the vent once you have those pieces and understand more about the client.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And so my last few questions for you are in the same vein, and they're all about sort of healing and sort of for yourself and for others. So broadly, if you look back, it's been my mind says for around 9 years also for you, what has broadly helped you heal? And maybe you've already said it, but if there's anything you would add.
So one, I think, huge important thing for me is community. I think having a community has helped me heal. I think you lose. Okay, I'll go back to community, but I think understanding leaving Judaism from a grief and loss perspective. I don't think I really grieved my losses or understood my losses. It was just, it's not true. I'm moving on to a different life. But I lost so many things when I left. I lost community. I lost certainty. I lost that comfort in my head that things would always be okay. I lost a feeling of safety. I lost feelings of security. I lost a lot. And I think we've all lost a lot. And I think until I recognized those losses, I wasn't able to start the process of healing from them. And I think I denied those losses for a while. Like, no, I didn't want it to be important to me. I didn't want it to matter to me that I left. I wanted it to be, I left and it was entirely the right decision, which I do think it was entirely the right decision. But I felt like the losses took away from that, and they don't. I think understanding those losses, respecting them, grieving them, and then making the changes. So rebuilding those losses. One of the things you do after grief and loss is a response to massive change. It's understanding what changed, but then also rebuilding your life to accommodate those changes. And that happens with any loss. So loss of a job, loss of a relationship, you have to rebuild those things. And I think that was the process that healed me the most, was rebuilding. So rebuilding community, rebuilding security, rebuilding self-esteem, rebuilding a sense of purpose, a goal in life, a lot of those things were really important to me to rebuild, and understanding that and being open to those changes. Because even when I left the religion, I was still fairly closed-minded. It was still very hard to engage with other cultures, other ways of thinking. I thought I was being super open-minded because I rejected the one tenet of everything. But I think over time, exploring more communities, making varied friends, and engaging with that, and engaging with the parts that shocked me and were very difficult for me, has been very healing. So, for example, my girlfriend right now is religious, not Jewish. She's Wiccan, but religious and devoted to her religion. And that was very strange for me in the beginning. And then getting used to that and getting connected to that gave me a ton of respect for it and a ton of value for it in a place of my life where I thought this could have no value. And I'm using that one example in a specific thing, but it's everything. It's all the parts of my life. There are so many parts of my life that were shut down because of Orthodox Judaism and because of leaving Orthodox Judaism. And then opening those up piece by piece, slowly but surely, and re-understanding who I am has really changed what it is for me to be an ex-Orthodox Jew.
Yeah. So there's a lot of quite nuanced things to actually unpack there. And I think in that vein, I'll ask you a question that hopefully it aligns. What would be your advice to your younger self / and then you'll tell me if it makes sense to even group this, other people who are currently leaving, who are closer along on their journey? And I think I'm curious what you'll speak to this is because what you described now is it can be very daunting, right? That journey of rebuilding what your life that is now a crumpled heap of debris on the ground, what used to be your house, and where do you even start with this? And yeah, I mean, I would imagine therapy probably plays a part somewhere in the mix of that, but I'm curious what else you would add.
So the advice I'd give to myself and to a lot of other people, but especially to myself, is you are responsible for your own life. I don't think I accepted that when I was Orthodox. And I think getting out of Orthodoxy, that was a very hard realization for me. It was because I don't really know if I like taking care of myself. There was some comfort in the idea that a community that you have to give to the community, but they will take care of you. And I think there's a lot of that within Orthodox Judaism, which is the feeling of, at least in some ways, other people will take care of us. I see it a lot in the ex-Orthodox community with people who are newly leaving, who come to the community, and their first question is, how are you guys going to take care of me? And the response by everyone is always we can help you. We are caring and giving, but we are not going to take care of you. You are ultimately responsible for yourself. And I think that's the biggest realization for everyone. And I wish I would have learned that lesson earlier. I wish I would have known that lesson and taken responsibility for my own life, as opposed to just saying I'm overwhelmed and I'll push it off and hopefully it will be taken care of later. And I think in general, the other thing about the journey is, because you described mine as very daunting, and it absolutely was. And I think if someone had told me this is the journey when I first came out, I would be very scared of it. But I didn't take that journey consciously. The steps to taking the journey of exploration are very small. It's just be open to new experiences, explore, and engage, and see where that takes you. Slowly over time. And if it's too much, don't go. And calm down and push past your comfort zones, but slowly. You don't have to go 1,000 miles outside of your comfort zone to be ex-Orthodox. And that won't be a good step to healing. I think it will cause a ton of damage by going too far, too fast, because you're very vulnerable in that state. And people in the real world, even outside of Orthodoxy, will take advantage of vulnerable people. I think so. Explore and just be open and you don't have to go down a huge path. Go down a path a little bit and then make a new decision on each one of those paths and consciously make your decisions. I think that's how we all got to being OTD. We all decided, no, I'm not going to let other people make the decision for me. Something about this decision, I have to make it for myself. So keep doing that, even on the small things. Keep coming to new situations and making your own decisions. And I think ultimately that will be the best step for everyone. And as far as therapy, yes, I encourage therapy for everyone. I don't think that necessarily I would say, oh, if you're OTD, get yourself into therapy right away. I would say to everyone, get yourself in therapy right away. But I don't feel that the OTD community necessarily needs it more than the public community. I think everyone needs it, and I think it would be helpful for everyone. But you're not broken. You're not damaged. You're not, I mean, you may be, but you're not definitionally because you're switching things. So go out, explore, be yourself, and see where it takes you. And follow what you enjoy. Follow what you connect with. And slowly begin that process of unmasking, of being yourself in different environments and seeing who accepts you as yourself and seeing who yourself is in those environments. I don't know, that was fairly long-winded of various things, but just go out there and be open and explore.
Yeah, I love it. I think that really summarizes it well. And final question for you before we can turn the tables and you can ask me whatever you want is, are there any final resources that you would recommend to people that might support them in this process?
Absolutely. So the first resources I would recommend to everyone is government resources. People are whenever anyone asks this question, people go to emotional resources or books. Government aid systems. So there are a lot of different things like food stamps, like WICs in the state in New York, like various supplementary programs and non-governmental agencies. So, for example, I was doing comedy by writing, but my journey to stand-up comedy was from a funded organization that provided arts experiences for people who identify as having mental health issues. And that got me, I joined a class where they trained me how to do comedy, and I met a whole bunch of interesting people. And there are various arts collectives in Toronto for that. There are all sorts of different programs. So first, before even OTD resources and the specific resources for that, just look at what's available from the society, because there's a lot. And there's a lot of support there that I think would be beneficial first and foremost. But along with that, Footsteps in the United States is a great organization. I would recommend any kind of social media presences. So there's a whole bunch of different online organizations. They're not really organizations, but just collectives of people. And there are in-person ones as well in most cities that have large Orthodox populations. So there are gatherings together, dinners, outings. So in Toronto, I host Friday night dinners for ex-Orthodox people. We also do hikes, museum outings, picnics, barbecues, things like that. So kind of social things are very helpful. I think exploring trauma and communal trauma can be very helpful. So understanding how it affects your body. There's the Body Keeps the Score. There's Gabo Mate's book, which I'm blanking on it right now, but it is excellent, the name of it. There is a lot of resources as far as understanding how trauma affects different things. I think understanding there's Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which is a model for how communities of coercive control act. And I think understanding that from an educational standpoint can be very helpful on it. And different people, the other thing is there's no one size fits all resource. So a lot of people gain a lot of benefit from exploring the history of Judaism. A lot of people have gained a lot of security and comfort in their decisions from that. And there's a lot of historians that have benefits in that way. There's a lot of resources as far as, well, there's a lot of domestic violence and shelters kind of resources that are very helpful all over the place. But I think my number one response to resources, just to be different than I'm sure what you're getting from other guests, is look into the government resources, look into the private ones that are not for Jews in your city, for people who are without community or people who are feeling lost in various ways. And you will find a world out there of support, unlike what I can find from the Jewish community.
Amazing. Thank you, Pesi. So if people want to find you, where should they look?
I have no idea. Well, you can just search for me online as a therapist. I practice under Paul Weinberg. I write on Facebook under the name Pesi Weinberg. Pesi Weinberg, my stand-up comedy. You can find me performing around Toronto or online on YouTube under Pesi Weinberg. My nature photography is on Instagram under the name Weinberg Pesi. Yeah, I'm not that public of a character, so I'm not that easy to find, but if you look for me in any of the things that I do, either Pesi Weinberg or Paul Weinberg in a Google search.
You will be after this episode goes out.
Oh, yeah. Well, now that I'm on this podcast, I'm worldwide.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pesi. And do you have any questions for me? Only if you'd like.
I don't have any prepped, but I would be curious. So you were saying that you came off it 9 years ago. You left 9 years ago, which is the same as me. I left in 2015. And I talked about my journey a little bit. I'm a little curious what your journey was for you.
For sure, yeah.
What your steps
It's funny because an episode with my entire story just came out last week. So I'm going to give the cliff notes of this one.
Okay.
And that is that I would say that I was very devoutly and emotionally almost bound to Judaism and really was trying my best to do an amazing job of it, or to be good at it, to seek approval in the eyes of God mostly. And there was a promise, and you'll be very familiar with this promise, the H promise, of if you follow these very difficult laws, your life will be happy and you will have meaning. That was the upside for what I perceived as a huge downside, the way I was living. And again, exposure to a lot of people in the world. My brother had already left religion. There was a lot of people who were living very different lives that seemed quite appealing, frankly, but I was doing this thing a certain way. And when it reached a head when my partner and I decided to divorce, my wife at the time decided, it was quite sudden, and it took me for a loop. And retroactively, all of those efforts that I'd done for so many years to try to be a good husband, and it's all on me and everything, I tried every possible thing that religion could possibly suggest that I do, from praying to reading Jewish books on marriage. There's only about 3 of them. And when that fell apart, I was like, there was so much anger at God, really. So it was also very abrupt, where I just let it fall apart overnight. I was similar to you. I had a gig booked as an assistant rabbi at my cousin's bar mitzvah. So I read from the Torah. I was Zilberman's trained, and so I could read the whole thing. And then but I was already not religious, but I had to put on the show. 2 weeks later, I was on a beach in Tel Aviv eating a falafel. And similar to you also, there was this process of, over the years, retroactive. I did not have the luxury of taking my time back then. There was a real urgency to getting out. Over the years, it's been an ongoing process of dismantling and grieving that which was that I left actually very quickly.
That's fascinating. I'm going to look forward to listening to the whole podcast.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And it's been great chatting.
Yeah, it was lovely being here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.